No one cares about your Navy career. My dad texted me right before the most important event of my sister's life. He actually ordered me to sit by the trash cans so my presence would not embarrass our family. It is funny because the second I finally walked into that ceremony, 30 battle-hardened SEALs jumped to their feet. A 4-star admiral demanded the room stand at attention, and then absolute silence fell over the crowd as my family realized they had just humiliated the wrong man. My name is Ryan, 34 years old, and I finally stopped trying to earn my family's conditional love. I flew straight from a classified overseas deployment to attend my sister Brittany's wedding rehearsal. Before I share how my father's ultimate insult turned into his complete financial ruin, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. The heavy glass doors of the Grand Atrium Country Club felt cold against my palm. I had not slept in 48 hours. I came directly from the airbase, my navy dress blues perfectly pressed, the dark fabric crisp, and the brass polished to a mirror shine. I simply wanted to honor my sister on her wedding weekend. I walked into the grand foyer breathing in the overwhelming scent of expensive lilies and roasted truffles. Laughter and the soft melody of a string quartet echoed from the main ballroom. I barely took 3 steps inside before my father Harrison intercepted me. He did not offer a hug. He did not say he was glad I made it back safely from a combat zone. He simply stopped in front of me, his eyes sweeping up and down my uniform with a look of pure, unfiltered disgust. "What on earth are you wearing?" he demanded, keeping his voice in a harsh, angry whisper. "I am wearing my dress blues," I replied, my voice perfectly steady. "It is the highest formal uniform I have." "You look like a cheap mall security guard," Harrison hissed, stepping closer to block my view of the ballroom. "Do you have any idea who is in that room right now? Jamal's family is worth billions. They own the largest defense and security technology firm on the East Coast. We are talking about generational wealth, Ryan. And you show up wearing this costume to remind everyone of your low-paying government job." I slowly adjusted my cuffs, feeling the stiff white fabric against my wrists. Looking into his angry eyes, I was instantly transported back to a Tuesday afternoon 16 years ago. I was 18 years old, standing in his home office, asking him to simply co-sign my student loans so I could attend a state university. Harrison had leaned back in his leather chair, looked at me with that exact same expression of contempt, and told me no. He said I was a bad investment compared to Brittany. Brittany was going to be the family's crowning achievement, the one who would marry into elite circles and elevate our social status. I was just a liability. He refused to risk his credit score on me. I walked out of his office, drove straight to a recruitment center, and enlisted in the military. I spent the next 16 years building a career that demanded blood, sweat, and absolute excellence. I became a Navy SEAL. I rose to the rank of commander. In the secret world of Tier 1 operators, I earned the call sign the Admiral because of my tactical planning and ability to bring my men home alive. I commanded teams who accomplished the impossible in the darkest corners of the world. But standing here in this brightly lit country club, my father still looked at me like I was a worthless investment. Harrison grabbed my arm, his grip tight with anxiety. "You are going to go into the back room right now," he ordered. "I rented a tuxedo for you. It is a standard black suit. It will help you blend in so you do not draw attention to yourself. I am trying to secure a massive investment contract from Jamal's father tonight, and I will not let your flashy little outfit ruin my chances." I looked down at his hand resting on my sleeve. My training taught me to assess threats, control my breathing, and neutralize hostility with calm precision. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply stared at his hand until he felt the shift in my posture and slowly pulled his fingers away. "I am not changing into a rented suit," I told him, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "This is my formal attire." Harrison's face turned a mottled shade of red. He was a man used to bullying his way through life, measuring everyone's worth by their bank accounts and designer labels. He had no concept of honor duty, or the incredible weight of the medals resting on my chest. To him, my military achievements were just pieces of cheap metal that did not generate quarterly dividends. "You are going to embarrass us," he threatened, stepping into my personal space. Jamal's family represents the highest tier of society. They do not want to be reminded of the gritty, ugly side of the world. They deal in executive boardrooms, not muddy trenches. You need to hide this military nonsense and act like a normal, successful person for one weekend. I glanced past his shoulder through the double doors leading into the dining hall. I could see the groom, Jamal, talking cordially with his groomsmen. Jamal was a brilliant African-American man whose family carried a legacy of profound discipline and respect. I knew for a fact that his family's massive defense company was built entirely by military veterans. Harrison was completely blind to their core values. He only saw their money, fundamentally misunderstanding the very people he was trying so desperately to impress. I took a slow breath, centering myself. The deep fatigue from my overseas deployment washed over me, but my resolve hardened into steel. I had survived active combat zones and highly classified extractions. I could certainly survive my father's superficial cruelty. "I will not cause a scene," I said, looking Harrison dead in the eye, "but I am not taking off my uniform. If you want to explain to Jamal's family why you forced your own son to change out of his military dress uniform, you can be my guest. Otherwise, excuse me, I am going to find my seat." I stepped around him smoothly, leaving him fuming silently in the grand foyer. The tension in the air was thick, a heavy precursor to the storm that was brewing. I knew my father would not let this go easily. I knew my mother Brenda and my sister Brittany would likely echo his shallow sentiments. But I walked into that luxurious ballroom with my head held high, completely prepared to face whatever humiliating tactics my family had planned for the night. I just did not realize how far they were actually willing to go to hide my existence from their new wealthy in-laws. I had barely crossed the threshold into the glittering expanse of the main ballroom when a hand clamped down hard on my shoulder. It was Harrison again. His grip was tight, his knuckles white with tension. He did not say a word, simply applying pressure to steer me away from the mingling guests and toward a narrow service corridor concealed behind a heavy velvet curtain. I could have easily broken his hold, but causing a physical altercation at my sister's wedding rehearsal was not part of my mission profile. I allowed him to guide me into a cramped, dimly lit coat room that smelled strongly of industrial cleaning supplies and damp wool. The moment the door clicked shut, Harrison spun around. He reached into a garment bag hanging from a metal rack and yanked out a black suit. He shoved the plastic hanger into my chest. "You are putting this on right now," Harrison commanded, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "I am not asking you, Ryan. I am telling you. If you walk out there looking like a recruitment poster, you will ruin everything I have worked for tonight." I caught the hanger, looking down at the fabric. It was a cheap, poorly constructed tuxedo. The lapels were shiny with synthetic polyester, and the stitching along the shoulders was already fraying. It was a rental, and a bottom-tier one at that. The contrast between this mass-produced garment and the immaculate tailored perfection of my navy dress blues was almost comical. Harrison wanted me to replace the uniform representing 16 years of elite service, sacrifice, and leadership with a polyester rental just so I would blend into the background of his superficial social climbing. Before I could formulate a response, the coat room door swung open. My mother Brenda slipped inside quickly, pulling the door shut behind her to ensure no guests saw us. She was wearing a sequined gown that looked distinctly uncomfortable, her hair sprayed into a rigid helmet of curls. The moment she saw me, her expression mirrored my father's absolute panic and deep-seated resentment. "Harrison, why is he still wearing that?" Brenda hissed, her hands fluttering anxiously around her diamond necklace. "The caterers are serving the appetizers, and Jamal's father is looking for you. We cannot have Ryan walking around looking like he just stepped out of a war zone. People will start asking questions. They will want to know why our son does not work in finance or law like everyone else here." "He is changing right now," Harrison snapped back, pointing a trembling finger at the cheap suit in my hands. Brenda let out a dramatic sigh, rubbing her temples as if my mere presence was inducing a migraine. "I do not understand why you always have to make things so difficult, Ryan." she complained, her voice dripping with the familiar condescension I had grown up with. "We go out of our way to include you in this beautiful weekend, and you repay us by trying to make a spectacle of yourself. Do you know how much trouble your father went through to get that tuxedo at the last minute? The rental shop was almost closed. It cost us $150 plus a rush fee. $150, Ryan, just so you could look decent for one night." The sheer absurdity of the situation washed over me. I was a Tier 1 operator. I commanded men in high-stakes global operations where million-dollar equipment was deployed routinely to secure national interests. I had managed classified budgets that would make Harrison's head spin. Yet here was my mother standing in a cramped coat room, aggressively tallying up a $150 rental fee as if it were a monumental burden I had placed upon their shoulders. Their frantic materialistic anxiety was palpable. They were sweating, their eyes darting around the small room, terrified that the wealthy family outside might discover they had a son who served in the military rather than sitting in a corner office. To them, my life was a liability to their social standing. I looked at the cheap suit, then at my parents. My tactical training dictated that you do not engage an irrational adversary with logic when the objective is simply to de-escalate and observe. Arguing with them would only fuel their manufactured drama. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me to feel small, indebted, and ashamed. I reached into the inner pocket of my dress blues and pulled out my leather wallet. I calmly opened it, retrieved 2 crisp $100 bills, and held them out to Brenda. "Keep the change," I said, my voice maintaining the steady, modulated tone I used during mission briefings. "Consider it a contribution to the rush fee." Brenda snatched the bills from my hands so fast I barely registered the movement. She quickly stuffed the cash into her sparkling clutch, her eyes avoiding mine. The transaction was seamless practice. She had always been eager to take, yet fiercely reluctant to give. Harrison crossed his arms, seemingly satisfied that his financial grievance had been addressed, though his glare remained hostile. "Just put the suit on," he muttered, adjusting his own expensive silk tie. "And when you come out, stay near the back. Do not approach Jamal's parents. Do not bring up your deployments. If anyone asks what you do, tell them you work in government logistics. It is vague enough that they will lose interest and walk away." I placed the rental suit carefully over the back of a folding chair. I did not break eye contact with my father. "I will wear the suit for the rehearsal dinner," I replied calmly. "It keeps the peace for tonight. But understand this. I am not ashamed of my service, and I am not hiding who I am." Harrison let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Who you are is a guy who takes orders for a living. Out there in the real world, in that ballroom, money gives the orders. Just remember your place tonight, Ryan." He turned on his heel and pushed his way out of the coat room, Brenda trailing closely behind him, her hand securely clutching the purse that now held my $200. I was left alone in the dim light of the service corridor. The air was thick with the dust of old coats and the lingering scent of my mother's heavy perfume. I slowly unbuttoned the jacket of my dress blues, treating the garment with the utmost respect. As I carefully folded it and placed it inside the plastic garment bag, I felt a deep, resonant calm settle in my chest. My family thought they had won this skirmish. They thought reducing me to a cheap polyester suit and demanding cash had put me in my place. They were operating on a tactical level so low it bordered on pathetic. I slipped into the scratchy, ill-fitting white shirt of the rental tuxedo, buttoning it up to the collar. I slid my arms into the cheap black jacket, feeling the restrictive, rigid cut of the cheap fabric across my broad shoulders. The sleeves were slightly too short, and the trousers pooled awkwardly around my polished shoes, but I did not care. The clothes did not define the man wearing them. I took a deep breath, inhaling the stale air of the coat room, allowing my heart rate to settle back into its resting rhythm. In the field, hesitation or emotional outbursts cost lives. Here, it would only cost me my dignity, which I refused to surrender. Every time they pushed, I simply adapted. It was an endurance test, one they did not realize they were taking part in. I checked my encrypted phone one last time before stepping out of the coat room. The operation was still a go for tomorrow. I adjusted the cheap synthetic bow tie, my face a mask of absolute chilling composure. I stepped out of the coat room and walked toward the ballroom, fully prepared to play their little game for one more night, knowing exactly what tomorrow would bring. The heavy oak doors to the main dining hall yielded under my grip, revealing a space that screamed of excessive wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over dozens of perfectly arranged circular tables. Waiters in pristine white jackets moved silently across the imported marble floor, carrying silver trays loaded with caviar and champagne. The air was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements and the low hum of strategic social climbing. I stood at the edge of the room in my stiff, ill-fitting rental tuxedo. My shoulders felt entirely too broad for the cheap synthetic fabric, but I kept my posture relaxed, scanning the environment with the practiced eye of a man used to assessing unfamiliar territory. It did not take long to identify the primary threat vector. My younger sister Brittany detached herself from a cluster of wealthy guests the moment she spotted me. She marched across the marble floor with a terrifying artificial smile plastered across her face. Even from 20 yards away, her hostility was palpable. She wore a rehearsal dinner gown that looked more like a theatrical costume, shimmering with hand-sewn jewels that caught the chandelier light with every aggressive step she took. At 29, Brittany had perfected the art of performing for an audience. She stopped inches from my chest, keeping her brilliant smile locked in place for the benefit of onlookers, while her eyes burned with toxic resentment. "I see you finally decided to cooperate," she muttered through gritted teeth, her smile never faltering. "Listen to me very carefully, Ryan. Tonight is about my future. Jamal's family is the absolute top tier of the East Coast defense industry. They deal with senators, international diplomats, and elite executives. I am not going to let you ruin this by talking about your sweaty, low-paying military job. If anyone asks you push papers at a desk, you do not mention deployments, you do not mention boots on the ground. You do absolutely nothing to remind these billionaires that my brother is a disposable government grunt." I looked down at her, maintaining a slow, steady breathing rhythm. Brittany leaned in closer, her expensive perfume clashing heavily with the hostility of her words. "Do you have any idea what is riding on this weekend?" she demanded in a harsh whisper. "This custom dress alone cost $40,000, and Dad paid for it outright because he knows it is an investment. Jamal's father controls a $25 million defense contract that Dad is pitching tonight. 25 million, Ryan. That contract will elevate our family into a completely different tax bracket. We are finally entering the inner circle of real power, and your gritty military aesthetic has no place here. Keep your mouth shut, stay by the kitchen, and do not humiliate me." Before I could offer a calm response to her tirade, a tall, impeccably dressed man stepped up behind her. Jamal, my soon-to-be brother-in-law, placed a gentle hand on the small of Brittany's back. He was a striking African-American man, 32 years old, radiating a quiet, grounded authority that immediately set him apart from the frantic energy of my family. He wore his custom-tailored suit with a familiar, rigid grace. His shoulders were squared, his chin parallel to the floor, his hands resting alertly at his sides. It was a posture I recognized instantly. It was the stance of a man raised around strict military discipline. "Everything all right over here?" Jamal asked, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded instant respect. Brittany practically spun around, her glare melting instantly into an expression of pure, saccharine adoration. "Of course, darling," she cooed, wrapping her arms around his bicep. "I was just catching up with my older brother. Ryan, this is Jamal." Jamal extended his hand toward me. His grip was exceptionally firm, calloused, and deliberate. It was not the soft handshake of a pampered billionaire heir, but the grip of someone who understood hard work. "Ryan," he said, looking me directly in the eyes with intense focus. "It is a genuine pleasure to finally meet you. Brittany has mentioned you a few times, though she kept the details pretty sparse. I understand you serve in the Navy." "I am currently active duty, yes," I replied, keeping my answer brief but maintaining strong eye contact. Jamal's posture subtly straightened even further at my confirmation. There was a distinct flicker of deep respect in his gaze, a silent acknowledgement that passed between us. "We take service very seriously in my family," Jamal said, his tone carrying a weight that completely flew over my sister's head. "My uncle serves. In fact, our entire company was founded on the principle of supporting the men and women on the front lines. I would love to sit down and hear about your career later, Ryan. We have a lot of respect for the uniform." Brittany's eyes widened in sheer panic. She had absolutely no idea about the core values of the family she was marrying into. To her defense, contracting was just a buzzword for corporate wealth. She missed that Jamal's family built their billions by revering the military culture she was trying to hide. She tightened her grip on his arm, forcibly pulling him a step backward. "Ryan's work is incredibly boring, babe." Brittany laughed, a shrill, nervous sound echoing poorly. "He just handles supply chains and inventory. Nothing exciting at all. Come on, your parents are waving at us from the VIP table. We really need to go mingle with the senators." Jamal allowed himself to be pulled away, but he did not break eye contact with me until he had to turn. "I look forward to that conversation," he called over his shoulder. I stood all alone, quietly watching them walk away. The tactical landscape was incredibly clear. Harrison was hunting a $25 million contract from a family that valued honor while hiding a decorated Navy commander in a cheap rented tuxedo. I retreated into the alcove near the kitchen service doors, allowing the dim lighting to mask the shiny synthetic fabric of my rented tuxedo. From this elevated vantage point, the entire ballroom laid out before me like a tactical map. I mapped the exits, noted the security personnel stationed by the grand staircase, and tracked the primary targets moving through the crowd. Harrison and Brenda were operating with the subtlety of a localized airstrike. They navigated the marble floor with predatory focus, their eyes locked entirely on two specific people near the massive floral centerpiece. They were hunting Jamal's parents. David and Cynthia stood with the kind of effortless grace that only comes from decades of true authority. David possessed the same rigid, disciplined posture as his son, his tailored suit hiding the unmistakable build of a former military officer. Cynthia radiated quiet elegance, engaging politely with a group of local politicians. They were the apex of the East Coast defense industry, controlling billions in federal contracts, yet they held themselves with quiet humility. Harrison struck with zero strategic patience. He bypassed a state senator and physically inserted himself into David's personal space. From 30 yards away, I could read the disastrous body language. Harrison leaned in too close, his shoulders hunched with eager desperation. He enthusiastically pumped David's hand, holding the grip far longer than socially acceptable. Brenda flanked them instantly, crowding Cynthia and launching into what was undoubtedly a heavily rehearsed monologue about our family's fabricated prestige. I watched Harrison pull a sleek leather portfolio from his jacket. He was actually pitching his mid-tier logistics firm at a wedding rehearsal dinner. It was a spectacular breach of etiquette. He jabbed his finger at the embossed folder, his face flushed with the exertion of his own sales pitch. He was desperate to secure the $25 million subcontract, treating the groom's parents like trapped investors rather than future family. David maintained a mask of total politeness, but his tactical tells were obvious to anyone trained to look. His weight shifted to his back foot, an instinctive defensive posture. His chin lowered slightly, and his eyes darted toward the perimeter, seeking an extraction route. Cynthia maintained a frozen, polite smile, her hands clasping her evening bag tight enough to whiten her knuckles. They were deeply uncomfortable, subjected to a barrage of shameless groveling and aggressive corporate begging. My father was utterly oblivious to their discomfort. He mistook their polite silence for captivated interest. He laughed loudly at his own jokes, slapping David on the shoulder. It was excruciating to witness. Harrison believed he was commanding the room, entirely unaware that he was actively destroying his own credibility with a family that valued honor, restraint, and discipline above all else. Before I could analyze the social train wreck any further, a sharp double vibration hit my chest. It was not my standard civilian cell phone. This vibration came from the inner pocket of my jacket, originating from my encrypted tactical device. As an active duty Tier 1 commander, I was required to carry it at all times, even while on domestic leave. A double vibration signaled a high priority transmission directly from Naval Special Warfare Command. I turned my back to the ballroom, slipping deeper into the shadows of the service alcove. I retrieved the heavy rubberized device. The screen remained dark until I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. A green light flashed and the secure messaging application opened. The sender ID displayed a secure alphanumeric code belonging to my direct superior at the Pentagon. I scanned the decrypted text, my eyes locking onto the capitalized mission parameters. Operation Status Update. VIP Security Clearance Approved. Admiral Winston has confirmed attendance for tomorrow's ceremony. Logistics secured. 30 operators from Echo Squadron are currently en route. Uniform is full-dress blues with decorations. Classified Valor Recognition approved for Commander Ryan to commence on site. End message. I read the text a second time, letting the sheer gravity of the words sink in. Admiral Winston. The pieces of the tactical puzzle slammed into place with devastating clarity. Jamal had mentioned his uncle served in the military. I had assumed he meant a standard officer or a retired veteran. I had vastly underestimated the reality. Admiral Winston was a 4-star admiral. He sat on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was one of the most powerful military commanders on the planet, dictating global defense strategies from the highest offices of the Pentagon. He was also the exact man whose signature was required to approve the $25 million defense contract Harrison was currently begging for. And Admiral Winston was Jamal's uncle. Tomorrow, this 4-star legend was not just attending a family wedding. He was utilizing the occasion to facilitate a classified honor ceremony. And he was bringing 30 of my deadliest, most battle-hardened SEAL brothers with him to execute it. I looked back out at the ballroom. Harrison was still aggressively cornering David, sweating through his expensive cologne, desperate to prove his worth to the defense contracting billionaires. He had ordered me to hide my military career because he thought it was a pathetic, low-paying embarrassment. He forced me into a cheap synthetic suit and told me to sit by the trash. He believed his superficial wealth was the only currency that mattered in this room. He had no idea that tomorrow, the very empire he was trying to infiltrate would drop to its knees in respect for the son he had just shoved into a coat room. He had no idea that 30 Tier 1 operators were currently flying across the country in full-dress uniforms to honor the man he deemed a bad investment. I locked the encrypted device and slid it back into my pocket. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I did not need to confront Harrison tonight. I did not need to argue with Brittany about her dress or my career. The trap was flawlessly set, engineered by their own blinding arrogance. All I had to do was maintain my cover, endure their petty insults for a few more hours, and wait for the sun to rise. The incoming storm was going to level their entire world. The morning of the wedding arrived with a frantic, suffocating energy that consumed the entire Grand Atrium Country Club. The sun had barely crested the manicured tree line, yet the estate was already swarming with panicked event coordinators, screaming florists, and stressed catering staff. I stood quietly near the service loading dock, holding a cup of black coffee, observing the chaotic deployment of resources. To my tactical eye, the event was a logistical disaster waiting to happen. There was no clear chain of command, no contingency planning, and communication was breaking down at every choke point. I remained perfectly still against the brick wall, conserving my energy, letting the civilian panic wash over me, without absorbing a single drop of it. Heavy, rapid footsteps echoed on the pavement. I did not need to turn my head to identify the approaching threat. Harrison was storming toward me, moving with the aggressive, erratic gait of a man who was rapidly losing control of his meticulously planned operation. His face was flushed a dangerous shade of crimson, and his expensive silk tie was already loosened around his neck. He was sweating profusely despite the cool morning air. Before he even reached striking distance, Harrison raised his right arm and hurled a heavy ring of metal directly at my chest. My reflexes, honed by thousands of hours of high-stress combat training, engaged automatically. My right hand snapped up, snatching the heavy bundle of car keys out of the air mere inches from my face. The metal edges bit into my palm, but I did not blink. I slowly lowered my hand, my eyes locked on his flushed, furious face. Two of the hired valet drivers just called in sick. Harrison barked, his voice ragged with panic and hostility. The regional manager told me they cannot send replacements in time. Jamal's extended family and the corporate executives are going to start arriving in less than 2 hours. I am not having billionaires wait in their cars because some minimum wage teenagers decided to sleep in. He pointed a shaking finger toward the front gates of the country club. Get out to the valet stand right now, Harrison commanded. The remaining drivers need someone to run the overflow lot. You are going to park the guest cars and keep the driveway completely clear. I looked at the heavy brass keys resting in my palm. I was a decorated Navy commander. I held security clearances that allowed me access to information Harrison could not even fathom. Within a few hours, a 4-star admiral and a squad of elite special operators would arrive to formally honor my service. And my biological father was ordering me to work as a parking attendant at my sister's wedding. At least your physical labor is good for something. Harrison spat, his upper lip curling into a sneer when I did not immediately respond. You do not have the social skills to talk to these people, and you certainly do not have the money to impress them. So you might as well use whatever muscle the military gave you to make yourself useful to this family for once. Go find the valet captain and put on one of their vests. Do not speak to the guests unless spoken to. Do not linger near the luxury vehicles. Just park the cars and stay out of sight. I maintained absolute silence. I did not clench my jaw. I did not tighten my fists. I simply controlled my breathing, drawing air in through my nose and letting it out slowly. In SEAL training, we undergo rigorous psychological conditioning designed to break a man's spirit. We are subjected to freezing water sleep deprivation and relentless verbal degradation by instructors whose sole purpose is to find our breaking point. They scream in our faces, insult our intelligence, and demean our worth, all while demanding complete physical compliance. Harrison's petty materialistic insults were nothing compared to the psychological warfare of survival evasion resistance and escape training. I treated his abuse exactly as I treated an interrogation drill. It was a test of endurance. Arguing with him would only validate his false sense of authority and risk blowing my cover before the optimal strike window. Compliance in this moment was not submission, it was tactical patience. I slipped the heavy ring of keys into the pocket of my cheap rented trousers. Understood, I replied, my voice steady, devoid of any emotional fluctuation. I will handle the overflow lot. Harrison looked marginally surprised by my immediate compliance, expecting the usual friction that defined our interactions. He quickly masked his surprise with a scoff of superiority, adjusting his jacket as if my obedience had somehow restored his faltering sense of control over the chaotic morning. See that you do, he muttered, turning his back on me to march toward a group of caterers who were struggling with a floral archway. And wipe that serious look off your face. Try to look like you are happy to be helping your sister. I walked away from the service dock, heading toward the long curved driveway at the front of the estate. The sun was climbing higher, bringing a heavy, oppressive heat that began to bake the asphalt. I found the valet captain, a stressed man in his early 20s, who looked incredibly relieved when I informed him I was stepping in to cover the personnel shortage. He handed me a cheap, brightly colored valet vest. I slipped it on over my white shirt, feeling the synthetic material trap the rising heat against my skin. I took my position at the far end of the reception canopy. The staging area was designed to funnel arriving luxury vehicles into a seamless procession of wealth and status. I stood at parade rest, my hands clasped behind my back, my feet shoulder-width apart. The heat radiating from the pavement grew intense, but I remained perfectly still. I had stood watch in the scorching deserts of the Middle East and the freezing mountains of the Hindu Kush. Standing in a country club driveway was a minor inconvenience. As the first wave of high-end sports cars and luxury sedans began to roll through the wrought iron gates, I stepped forward to perform the menial labor my father deemed my only valuable asset. I opened doors for strangers wearing watches that cost more than a junior enlisted sailor's annual salary. I accepted keys with a polite nod, sliding behind the wheels of imported vehicles and executing flawless, efficient parking maneuvers in the overflow lot. Every time I jogged back to the staging area, the sun beat down harder, soaking the back of my cheap shirt with sweat. I could see Harrison inside the air-conditioned glass lobby, schmoozing with early arrivals, completely ignoring the sun he had banished to the pavement. He thought he had degraded me. He thought he had finally forced me into the subservient role he always believed I deserved. But as I caught another set of keys thrown by a careless guest, my mind remained entirely focused on the encrypted message from the night before. I parked a massive black SUV, my hands steady on the leather steering wheel. The degradation was temporary. The impending shockwave was permanent. I just had to keep parking cars until the real guests arrived. I slid into the driver's seat of a pristine slate gray Mercedes G-Wagon. The vehicle practically hummed with excess a $150,000 machine designed for rugged terrain, but relegated to country club driveways. The leather interior was cool against my sweat-dampened shirt. I shifted the heavy SUV into gear and navigated it expertly toward the furthest edge of the overflow lot, executing a flawless parallel park between two equally expensive sports cars. I pulled the key from the ignition, stepped out into the oppressive midday heat, and began the long jog back to the main staging area. The sun was punishing, beating down on the asphalt and radiating upward to roast the soles of my polished uniform shoes. I maintained an even, measured pace. Controlling my heart rate and core temperature was second nature. I wiped a single bead of sweat from my brow, keeping my breathing regulated as I rounded the corner of the grand fountain separating the lot from the main entrance. That was when I spotted Jamal. My soon-to-be brother-in-law had pushed his way out of the heavy glass doors of the lobby, stepping onto the shaded portico to escape the suffocating chaos inside. He was already fully dressed in his custom-tailored wedding suit, looking immaculate, but his posture betrayed a deep, underlying tension. He rolled his shoulders, taking a deep breath of the humid air. His eyes closed as he sought a brief moment of mental clarity away from the frantic energy of the wedding planners and my deeply superficial family. I intended to walk past him without engaging, sticking strictly to Harrison's orders to remain out of sight. But my heavy footsteps on the pavement drew his attention. Jamal opened his eyes and turned his head. His gaze locked onto me, and the relief of solitude instantly vanished from his face, replaced by absolute, unfiltered shock. He stared at my cheap, brightly colored valet vest, the sweat soaking through my collar, and the heavy ring of keys dangling from my hand. For a man raised in a billionaire defense contracting family, a family that prized honor duty and military service above all else, seeing his future brother-in-law performing menial physical labor in the driveway was a severe cognitive disconnect. Ryan Jamal called out, his deep baritone cutting through the ambient noise of the idling engines. He stepped off the shaded portico and marched directly into the glaring sun to meet me halfway. "What on earth are you doing out here?" I stopped at attention, maintaining my professional bearing. "I am assisting with the overflow parking," I replied, my voice steady and neutral. "The valet service experienced a personnel shortage this morning. I stepped in to ensure the driveway remains clear for the arriving guests." Jamal looked utterly bewildered. He glanced back at the air-conditioned lobby, then back at my sweat-soaked shirt. "You are the bride's brother," he said, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "You are an active-duty naval officer. You should not be out here running keys in the blistering heat. Have you been doing this all morning?" "It is not a problem," I stated simply. "The mission required extra hands. I provided them." Jamal shook his head, his expression shifting from confusion to a profound, quiet respect. He recognized the stoicism. He recognized the complete absence of ego in my response. "I told you last night that my family deeply respects the uniform," Jamal said, stepping closer. "And I meant it. You are a guest of honor today, not hired help. Take that vest off. You are coming inside with me right now. We are going to find a quiet room, grab a drink, and you can tell me about your service." I insist. It was a genuine, honorable offer from a man who clearly possessed the integrity my biological family lacked. I opened my mouth to politely decline, knowing that breaking my cover now would ruin the tactical advantage I held for the impending arrival of his uncle. Before a single syllable could leave my lips, the glass doors of the lobby violently burst open. Harrison stormed out onto the pavement, his face contorted in a mask of absolute panic and furious indignation. He had been watching from inside, terrified that my interaction with the billionaire groom would expose the very reality he was trying to hide. He practically sprinted across the driveway, placing himself directly between Jamal and me. "Ryan, what do you think you are doing?" Harrison hissed, his voice trembling with manufactured authority. "I told you to stay in the overflow lot. Why are you up here bothering the VIPs? He did not even wait for my response. He immediately pivoted to Jamal, his entire demeanor shifting instantly from aggressive hostility to sickening, subservient panic. "Jamal, I am so incredibly sorry," Harrison stammered, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "I told the valet staff to keep the driveway clear so you could have a moment of peace. Ryan was just supposed to be moving cars. He knows he should not be harassing the wedding party. Please go back inside where it is cool. I will handle this immediately." Jamal did not move. His posture remained perfectly rigid, but the temperature in his eyes dropped significantly. He looked at Harrison, assessing the frantic, sweating man with a sudden, chilling clarity. "He is not harassing me, Harrison," Jamal said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I called him over. I invited my future brother-in-law inside to have a drink with me. Why is he out here parking cars in the first place?" Harrison laughed, a high, nervous sound that grated against the ears. "Oh, you know, Ryan," he deflected rapidly, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. "He has always been a bit aimless, always struggling to find his place. We thought giving him a simple task would make him feel included today. He does not really fit in with the corporate crowd inside, so physical labor is just better for everyone. Now, Ryan, hand over those keys to the captain and get back to the back lot before you cause a scene." Harrison glared at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, silent threat. He was doubling down on his own delusion, utterly convinced that his wealth-based hierarchy was the only reality that mattered. He believed he was protecting his investment. He had no idea he was actively detonating it. I did not argue. I did not defend my honor. I simply nodded, executed a crisp, perfect about-face, and jogged back toward the valet stand without looking back. As I moved away, my peripheral vision caught the aftermath. Jamal remained planted on the pavement, ignoring Harrison's frantic attempts to usher him back inside. Jamal was a smart man. He had grown up around generals, admirals, and defense strategists. He knew what a man with zero discipline looked like, and he was currently looking right at Harrison. Then Jamal turned his head and watched me jog away. His eyes narrowed into dark, suspicious slits. The gears in his mind were turning with lethal precision. The carefully constructed facade of my family's elite status had just cracked wide open. Jamal had recognized the quiet, lethal discipline in my stance, and he had just witnessed my father treat me like disposable garbage. The groom now knew something was terribly wrong with the family he was marrying into. The battlefield was primed, the targets were marked, the trap was ready to spring. I settled back into my position at the front of the valet queue, letting the cheap synthetic fabric of my bright vest absorb the punishing mid-morning heat. The country club driveway had temporarily cleared of the initial wave of luxury sports cars, leaving a brief, heavy stillness in the air. The valet captain, a college kid named Tyler, leaned against the podium, wiping sweat from his forehead, completely unaware of the tactical shift about to occur. A low, synchronized rumble breached the quiet of the estate. It was not the high-pitched whine of an Italian sports car or the refined purr of a luxury sedan. This sound was deep, guttural, and undeniably federal. 3 matching black Chevrolet Suburbans turned onto the main driveway. My eyes immediately began cataloging their specifications. These were not standard civilian models. The heavy, sluggish way they handled the slight incline indicated level B6 ballistic armoring. The tires were run flats. The tinted windows were several inches thick, designed to withstand sustained automatic weapons fire. They moved in a flawless diamond formation, keeping the center vehicle perfectly shielded from all possible angles of attack. Tyler, the valet captain, scrambled to stand upright, frantically waving his hands to direct the massive vehicles toward our standard drop-off zone. I stepped forward and smoothly grabbed his shoulder, pulling him back. You do not flag down a federal motorcade like it is a minivan. You let them dictate the perimeter. The three SUVs rolled to a synchronized halt directly under the grand portico, completely blocking the main entrance. The heavy doors of the lead and rear vehicles opened simultaneously. 6 men stepped out onto the pavement. They did not wear tuxedos or designer suits. They wore dark, tactical business attire tailored to conceal shoulder holsters and communication gear. Their posture was rigid, their heads on a swivel, eyes hidden behind dark, polarized sunglasses. They moved with a lethal, coordinated efficiency that immediately identified them as highly trained federal security agents, likely the advance element for Admiral Winston's arrival tomorrow, securing the venue 24 hours ahead of the main event. The lead agent stepped out of the front passenger seat of the primary vehicle. He was a broad-shouldered man with a prominent scar cutting through his left eyebrow. I recognized him instantly. It was Special Agent Collins. We had run a joint counterterrorism task force operation in Damascus 4 years ago. He was a seasoned professional, a man who had seen the worst of humanity and survived it through sheer discipline. Collins adjusted the earpiece coiled around his neck and began his standard visual sweep of the immediate area. He checked the roofline, scanned the glass windows of the lobby, and then his gaze swept over the valet stand. His eyes locked directly onto me. For a fraction of a second, the highly trained federal agent froze. The cognitive dissonance of seeing his former tactical commander, a decorated Tier 1 operator, known throughout the special warfare community as the Admiral, wearing a cheap neon-colored valet vest in a country club driveway, caused a visible glitch in his normally flawless composure. I watched his muscle memory take over. Collins instinctively squared his shoulders. His back went perfectly straight. His right arm began to snap upward, executing the rigid, deeply ingrained motion of a formal military salute. He was about to loudly acknowledge my rank and blow my cover in front of the entire country club staff. I caught his eye and executed a sharp, microscopic tactical signal. It was a movement so subtle that a civilian would never register it. A fractional lowering of my chin, a deliberate hardening of my stare, and a nearly imperceptible shake of my head. Stand down. Maintain cover. Collins received the unspoken command instantly. His training kicked in, overriding his initial shock. The upward trajectory of his right arm seamlessly transformed into a casual motion to adjust his dark sunglasses. He dropped his hand back to his side, his posture relaxing just a fraction to blend in, but his eyes conveyed a message of absolute unwavering respect. He understood that an operation was underway. He did not know the parameters, but he knew better than to question my positioning. Before any further silent communication could occur, the glass doors of the lobby practically shattered open. Harrison burst onto the portico, sprinting with the frantic energy of a desperate salesman. He had seen the armored SUVs pulling up and immediately assumed they belonged to the highest echelon of Jamal's billionaire defense contracting family. He was sweating profusely, his silk tie flapping over his shoulder as he jogged toward the federal agents, his face stretched into an obsequious, groveling smile. "Welcome, welcome to the Grand Atrium!" Harrison practically shouted, rushing toward Agent Collins with both hands extended. "I am Harrison, the father of the bride. We are so incredibly honored to have you here. Please let my staff handle your vehicles. We have VIP parking secured directly behind the main hall." Collins looked at Harrison with the cold, detached assessment of a predator analyzing a minor nuisance. He did not accept the handshake. He merely stared at Harrison's outstretched hands until my father awkwardly lowered them, clearing his throat in profound embarrassment. Harrison, desperate to recover his footing and project authority, spun around and locked his eyes on me. "Ryan," he barked, snapping his fingers aggressively in my direction. "Do not just stand there like a useless mannequin. Get over here and take the keys from these gentlemen. Ensure these vehicles are parked in the platinum section immediately. Move it." I maintained my blank professional expression and stepped forward. As I approached the lead vehicle, Agent Collins looked from Harrison's sweating, furious face to my calm demeanor. The federal agent was a master of reading human dynamics, and he instantly assessed the situation. He realized this frantic, superficial man was speaking to a legendary Navy SEAL as if he were a disposable servant. Collins did not hand the keys to Harrison. He stepped directly past my father, ignoring him completely, and walked straight up to me. Collins stopped a mere foot away. He looked me dead in the eye. He slowly extended his hand, pressing the heavy key fob into my palm. He held the exchange for exactly 2 seconds longer than necessary, a silent transmission of absolute solidarity and profound respect between warriors. "We will need these staged for rapid departure," Sir Collins said, his voice lowering just enough so that only I could hear the honorific title attached to the end of his sentence. "Understood," I replied evenly, closing my fist around the keys. Harrison hovered a few feet away, practically vibrating with nervous energy, completely and utterly oblivious to the massive power dynamic playing out right in front of his face. He thought he was commanding the situation. He thought he was impressing the federal agents by ordering me around. He had zero comprehension that the heavily armed men standing in his driveway were currently evaluating him with total disgust while silently treating the valet as the highest-ranking authority in the state. I turned on my heel and walked toward the driver's side of the armored Suburban, the trap tightening flawlessly around my father's ignorant pride. I climbed into the heavy command vehicle. The reinforced door shut with a solid, airtight thud, instantly cutting off Harrison's frantic voice. The interior smelled of sterile leather and gun oil. I gripped the thick steering wheel, shifting the massive machine into gear. I guided the 3 ballistic SUVs to the secure staging area directly behind the main hall, positioning them exactly as Agent Collins needed for rapid deployment. I parked them facing the exit, leaving adequate space for tactical maneuvering. I secured the keys and jogged back to the front driveway. The heat was reaching its absolute peak, but my mind was operating with cold, calculating clarity. The real influx of Jamal's extended family began moments later. This was not the loud, flashy arrival of newly rich socialites looking to show off their sports cars. This was the arrival of true generational power. A procession of understated, immaculate black Maybachs and extended wheelbase sedans rolled quietly up the driveway. There were no revving engines or blaring music. The doors opened, and men and women stepped out, moving with an unmistakable quiet dignity. They wore impeccably tailored suits and elegant conservative dresses. They did not wear massive gaudy jewelry or carry oversized designer bags covered in logos. Their wealth was so immense, so deeply entrenched in the military-industrial complex, that they had absolutely nothing to prove to anyone. They moved with the same disciplined situational awareness as Jamal. These were people who dined with defense secretaries and commanded global supply chains. Harrison nearly tripped over his own expensive leather shoes rushing to greet them. He practically sprinted down the front steps of the country club, leaving a trail of expensive cologne in his wake. I stood near the valet podium, maintaining my parade rest posture, and watched my biological father humiliate himself on a spectacular scale. He began aggressively shaking hands, grabbing the elbows of Jamal's relatives, and invading their personal space with desperate, wide-eyed enthusiasm. "Welcome to our little slice of paradise," Harrison boomed, his voice echoing loudly against the stone portico. "It is an absolute honor to host you all today. I was just telling the club president the other day, because I play golf with him every Tuesday, that we needed the premium champagne reserve unlocked for this crowd. Only the best for my new family." Jamal's relatives offered polite, restrained smiles. They did not pull away, but their body language grew instantly rigid. They assessed Harrison with the same cold, calculating glances that Agent Collins had used earlier. They recognized a loud, insecure man compensating for a lack of true substance. Harrison missed their subtle discomfort completely. He doubled down on his boasting, projecting his voice so everyone in the immediate vicinity could hear his manufactured success. "We spared absolutely no expense for Brittany today," Harrison bragged, adjusting his silk tie and puffing out his chest proudly. I told my logistics team to handle all my corporate accounts this week so I could focus entirely on this merger of our two great families. My firm is actually positioning for a massive expansion into the defense sector next quarter. We are projecting record-breaking growth. We should sit down later and discuss some synergy. I have a highly tactical mindset for business operations. I watched a tall, distinguished older man, likely one of Jamal's uncles, slowly raise a single eyebrow at the inappropriate use of the word tactical. The man simply offered a tight, polite nod, murmured a brief greeting, and guided his wife past Harrison into the air-conditioned lobby. Harrison stood on the pavement, his chest still puffed out, grinning like a man who believed he had just conquered the entire defense industry. He had absolutely no idea that he had just labeled himself an opportunistic clown in front of people who valued quiet competence and ironclad integrity. The final vehicle in the procession was parked. The driveway finally fell quiet. The heavy rush of arriving guests had successfully transitioned inside the country club. I looked at the young valet captain Tyler, who was leaning against the wooden podium completely exhausted and drenched in sweat. "The perimeter is clear," I told him, keeping my voice low and even. "I am returning to my duties inside. Keep the front lane open for emergency vehicles and maintain strict control of the keys." Tyler nodded gratefully, too exhausted to question my sudden departure. I reached up and unfastened the cheap neon-colored valet vest. I pulled it off my shoulders, immediately feeling the slight relief of the cool breeze against my damp white shirt. I folded the vest neatly, placed it on the valet podium, and turned my back on the sun-baked driveway. I did not walk through the grand front doors. I had no intention of dealing with Harrison's manic energy or Brittany's narcissistic demands out in the open lobby. Instead, I navigated around the side of the sprawling estate, following the manicured hedges toward the rear service entrance. I moved silently past the massive outdoor cooling units and industrial dumpsters. I found the heavy steel door reserved for catering staff and maintenance workers. I pulled it open and slipped into the cool, chaotic environment of the country club's commercial kitchen. Waiters rushed past me carrying massive silver trays of appetizers. Chefs shouted orders over the roar of industrial ventilation hoods. The air smelled of roasting meats and expensive spices. No one paid any attention to a tall man in a cheap black suit, walking with silent, purposeful strides through their busy workspace. I navigated the maze of stainless steel prep tables, avoiding a rolling cart of crystal glasses, moving deeper into the facility. My mission on the pavement was complete. The final phase of the operation was about to begin inside. I steadied my breathing and stepped toward the main hall. Bypassing the swinging double doors that led directly into the opulent reception area. Instead, I veered left down a narrow, uncarpeted hallway reserved exclusively for the country club's maintenance staff. The transition from the extravagant, billionaire-filled lobby to this stark, utilitarian corridor was jarring but welcome. It matched the stark realities of my life far better than the synthetic luxury out front. I found a secluded staff locker room near the rear loading docks, a space smelling faintly of bleach and damp mop heads. The room was empty, the heavy steel door swinging shut behind me with a reassuring click. I engaged the deadbolt. I stood in the center of the cramped room, beneath a flickering fluorescent bulb. Without a moment of hesitation, I stripped off the neon-colored valet vest and tossed it onto a battered folding chair. Next came the cheap rented tuxedo jacket and the scratchy, ill-fitting white shirt. The synthetic polyester clung to my damp skin, suffocating and restrictive. I peeled the fabric away, discarding the garments that Harrison had forced upon me to diminish my existence. They collapsed into a lifeless, pathetic heap on the concrete floor, representing exactly what they were, a flimsy disguise meant to hide truth and project a fragile lie. I stepped toward a deep, stainless steel utility sink in the corner. I turned the heavy brass knobs, letting the freezing water rush over my hands. I aggressively splashed the icy liquid over my face, the back of my neck, and my chest, washing away the grime of the asphalt and the suffocating heat of the overflow parking lot. I grabbed a coarse paper towel and dragged it across my skin. As I looked up into the cracked water-spotted mirror mounted above the sink, I stared at a man forged by extreme adversity and unrelenting discipline. My torso carried the physical, undeniable ledger of my 16-year military career. The jagged silver scar tracking across my left collarbone from a shrapnel wound sustained during a high-value target raid in Helmand Province. The smooth, raised burn mark on my right flank from a chaotic, near-fatal helicopter extraction in the Horn of Africa. My biological father genuinely believed that unskilled manual labor was my only utility. He was completely tragically oblivious to the fact that my body and mind had been weaponized and repeatedly sacrificed for the security of the very nation that allowed him to play his petty corporate games in safety. I tossed the damp paper towel into a bin and turned to the far corner of the room. Tucked securely behind a row of rusted metal lockers was my heavy black nylon garment bag. I had strategically staged it here earlier in the morning during the initial vendor load in knowing with absolute certainty that this exact moment would arrive. I unzipped the heavy bag, the metallic sound loud and sharp in the quiet room. Inside hung my authorized navy dress blues. The fabric was immaculate, dark as a moonless ocean, carrying an inherent commanding weight that commanded immediate respect. I slipped on the pristine, bright white dress shirt, buttoning it with precise, deliberate movements. The high-quality cotton was crisp, perfectly tailored to the broad dimensions of my frame. I fastened the collar, feeling the familiar grounding restriction against my neck. I stepped into the dark, heavy wool trousers, adjusting the belt, and then reached for the jacket. Slipping my arms into the heavy wool jacket felt like donning armor. The cheap, suffocating constraints of Harrison's rented tuxedo were completely eradicated. In their place was the undeniable physical manifestation of authority, discipline, and absolute lethal competence. The polished gold buttons gleamed brilliantly under the harsh fluorescent light. I adjusted my cuffs, ensuring the dark fabric laid perfectly flat and pristine. Then came the most vital, undeniable part of the uniform. I reached into the specialized inner compartment of the garment bag and retrieved a small velvet-lined mahogany box. I opened the brass clasp. Resting on the dark fabric were my military decorations. I had deliberately omitted them during the rehearsal dinner to maintain a low profile and observe the battlefield dynamics. Now the operational parameters had drastically shifted. Admiral Winston and 30 of my elite Tier 1 operators were inbound. It was time to display the uncompromising truth. I picked up the heavy metal ribbons and began pinning them to the left breast of my jacket. The metal clinked softly in the quiet locker room, a sharp, crystalline sound that carried infinitely more weight than any bank transaction Harrison had ever executed. First, I secured the silver star. The silver starburst anchored on a ribbon of red, white, and blue. It was awarded for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. I earned it during a relentless, brutal firefight where my team was pinned down by overwhelming enemy forces, and I had to orchestrate an aggressive flanking maneuver that saved 12 American lives. Next to it, I pinned the Navy Cross. It is the second highest military decoration that can be awarded to a member of the United States Navy, awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. The heavy bronze cross rested solidly against my chest. I earned that cross for an operation that I was legally not allowed to discuss, an operation where I carried a severely wounded teammate 2 miles through hostile territory under the cover of darkness, bleeding from my own severe injuries the entire way. I added the Purple Heart, the combat action ribbons, and finally the distinct gold trident of the SEALs. The eagle globe and anchor gleamed with quiet, lethal pride. By the time I finished, the left side of my chest was a brilliant, visually stunning tapestry of valor, sacrifice, and supreme tactical leadership. The sheer weight of the metals pulled the fabric perfectly taut across my chest. I looked in the cracked mirror one final time. The man staring back was not a valet. He was not an embarrassment. He was not a failed investment. He was Commander Ryan, known as the Admiral in the most dangerous corners of the globe. The metals caught the flickering light, casting sharp reflections against the dull walls. The contrast was absolute. My family operated on deception, cheap rented suits, and desperate social climbing. I operated on honor, spilled blood, and undeniable truth. I secured the empty velvet box and the garment bag, stashing them back behind the lockers. I turned my back on the cheap, discarded polyester tuxedo resting on the damp floor. I unlocked the deadbolt and pushed open the heavy maintenance door, my posture naturally shifting into the rigid, commanding presence expected of a senior military officer. My stride was measured, even, and entirely silent. I stepped out of the service corridor and transitioned seamlessly into the plush, heavily carpeted hallway leading directly toward the grand ballroom. The air here was refreshingly cool, scented with expensive floral arrangements and the faint trace of high-end catering. The muffled sounds of polite, wealthy chatter and clinking crystal drifted down the long, elegant corridor. I walked down the center of the hallway, the polished leather of my uniform shoes sinking slightly into the expensive carpet. My breathing was slow and steady. My heart rate rested at a perfectly calm 50 beats per minute. I was no longer an observer. I was no longer playing the role of a subservient outcast hiding in the shadows of a country club driveway. I was an active duty Tier 1 commander, walking straight into the heart of my biological father's fragile, fabricated empire. The heavy wooden doors of the grand ballroom loomed at the end of the hallway, standing tall and imposing. I did not break my stride. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead, preparing to step into the light and face the family who mistakenly thought they could bury my existence. The heavy wooden doors of the grand ballroom loomed at the end of the plush corridor. I could hear the swelling tempo of a string quartet warming up for the main event, interwoven with the frantic buzzing of event coordinators managing the final seating arrangements. I closed the distance with measured, even strides. The polished floor swallowed the sound of my footsteps. Before my hand could even reach the brass handle of the ballroom door, the heavy oak panel was violently yanked open from the inside. Brittany stormed out into the hallway. She was flanked by two nervous bridesmaids who were desperately trying to adjust the massive trailing train of her $40,000 custom wedding gown. Her face was a twisted mask of bridezilla fury, barking orders at her terrified attendants about the floral arrangements being the wrong shade of white. She looked up from her aggressive micromanaging, ready to unleash her wrath on whatever unlucky country club staff member happened to be in her path. Instead, her eyes locked onto me. The transformation was instantaneous and physically jarring. Brittany froze mid-step. Her mouth dropped open, breaking her carefully contoured makeup lines. The two bridesmaids bumped into her, apologizing profusely, but Brittany did not even acknowledge them. She stared at the crisp, dark wool of my navy dress blues, her gaze tracking upward to the brilliant gold buttons, the pristine white collar, and finally the heavy cluster of gleaming metal medals anchored to my left chest. For a fraction of a second, I thought I saw a glimmer of understanding. But that would require a level of self-awareness my sister fundamentally lacked. Her shock instantly and violently morphed into pure, unfiltered narcissistic rage. "What in the world are you wearing?" Brittany shrieked. Her voice echoed sharply down the elegant corridor, causing her bridesmaids to flinch and step back in sheer terror. I stood my ground, my posture remaining at a flawless position of attention. "I am wearing my formal military uniform," I replied, my voice projecting a low, steady calm that contrasted heavily with her escalating hysteria. Brittany closed the distance between us in 3 aggressive strides, completely ignoring the expensive fabric of her gown dragging awkwardly across the carpet. She jabbed a manicured finger directly at the center of my chest, stopping just an inch from the silver star. "You are wearing a costume," she screamed, her face flushing with toxic red splotches. "You are wearing a ridiculous, flashy costume. I specifically told you last night that Jamal's family is elite. They are billionaires. They do not want to see some tragic government worker parading around their elegant event. And what did you do? You deliberately ignored me and showed up looking like a complete clown to steal my spotlight." I looked down at her pointed finger, analyzing her outburst with tactical detachment. She was operating entirely on ego and profound ignorance. She had absolutely no concept of the global defense industry, her future in laws controlled. She only knew they had money. "This is not a costume, Brittany," I stated, maintaining eye contact. These are the dress blues of a United States Navy commander. Do not use your fake military jargon with me, she spat, her voice climbing an octave higher. You did this on purpose. You could not stand the fact that today is entirely about me. You could not handle that I am marrying into a family of real power and wealth while you have nothing. So you went out and rented this hideous outfit to draw attention to yourself. She gestured wildly toward my medals, her eyes wide with frantic, delusional anger. And what are those? She demanded, her voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. Did you buy those cheap metal props at a pawn shop? Are you trying to make yourself look like some kind of fake war hero just to upstage my wedding dress? My dress cost $40,000, Ryan. It took a team of Parisian designers 6 months to make. You are not going to ruin my flawless aesthetic by standing in the background covered in shiny fake trinkets. I felt a cold, sharp anger flare deep within my chest, but I ruthlessly suppressed it. The Silver Star and the Navy Cross were not cheap props. They were forged in the blood of my brothers in arms. They represented men who had taken their last breaths in my arms on foreign soil. They represented agonizing physical rehabilitation and unbearable sacrifice. To hear this spoiled, vain woman reduce them to pawn-shop trinkets designed to upstage her dress was an insult of the highest magnitude. Yet I did not raise my voice. Reacting emotionally would only feed her narcissistic supply. These medals were awarded for valor in combat. I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. They are not props. They are the reality of the freedom you enjoy every single day. Brittany let out a loud, mocking laugh that bounced off the hallway walls. Valor, she scoffed, waving her hands in the air. Oh, please. Nobody cares about your imaginary valor. Nobody cares about your deployments to whatever dusty third world country you claim to have visited. The people in that ballroom deal with real power. They deal in millions of dollars. They are going to look at you covered in those tacky fake pins, and they are going to laugh behind your back. You are going to humiliate our father right when he is about to secure the biggest contract of his life. She stepped even closer, her eyes blazing with an unhinged, desperate need for control. Take them off, she commanded, her voice dropping to a vicious, threatening hiss. Take off the jacket and take off those ridiculous fake medals right now. Go back to the coat room, put that rental suit back on, and go sit out of sight. If you step 1 foot into my ballroom looking like this, I will have the security team physically drag you out into the street. I stared down at her. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving with the exertion of her own tantrum. Her bridesmaids were huddled against the wall, exchanging horrified glances, clearly realizing they were witnessing a catastrophic family meltdown. Brittany firmly believed her threats carried weight. She believed she commanded the environment because her father had paid for the flowers and the catering. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that I had faced down warlords who would not hesitate to execute their own men for a minor infraction. A screaming bride in a white dress held absolutely zero tactical authority over me. I am not removing my uniform, I told her, my voice echoing with finality. And I am not removing my decorations. Brittany opened her mouth to scream again, her face contorting into an ugly mask of pure rage. She raised her hands, looking as though she might actually try to physically rip the medals from my chest herself. The hallway tension reached a boiling point, the elegant country club atmosphere completely shattered by her uncontrolled narcissism. The sudden screech of hinges cutting through the tense air signaled a new arrival. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom flew open with such force that they slammed against the interior walls. Harrison burst into the corridor. His face was slick with perspiration, his expensive silk tie hanging askew around his neck. He had clearly abandoned his desperate networking inside, drawn out by the echoing shrillness of his daughter screaming in the hallway. Harrison stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes darted from Brittany, who was hyperventilating in her massive wedding gown, to the 2 terrified bridesmaids pressed flat against the floral wallpaper, and finally to me. The color instantly drained from his face, replaced by an ashen, sickly pallor. He stared at the pristine, dark fabric of my navy dress blues, his gaze locking onto the brilliant gold buttons and the heavy, undeniable cluster of combat decorations gleaming on my chest. For a moment, the only sound in the corridor was Brittany's frantic breathing. Harrison looked as if he had just witnessed a ghost. He blinked rapidly, his mind struggling to process the visual reality of his son standing before him in the highest tier of military formality. He had explicitly ordered me into a cheap rental tuxedo. He had banished me to the overflow parking lot. He had demanded I remain invisible. Yet here I was projecting an aura of absolute uncompromising authority that his corporate wealth could never purchase. The shock evaporated in an instant, replaced by a dark, volatile fury. Harrison lunged forward. He crossed the carpeted distance between us in 3 frantic strides. He reached out with both hands, his fingers curling into claws, and clamped down hard on my left bicep. He intended to physically drag me away from the ballroom entrance, to pull me back into the shadows of the maintenance corridor where he believed I belonged. He yanked backward with all his might. I did not budge a single millimeter. My boots remained perfectly rooted to the floor. My posture did not shift. The sudden exertion caused Harrison to lose his own footing, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the carpet as his momentum rebounded against my immovable frame. He grunted in frustration, his fingers digging desperately into the thick wool of my uniform jacket, trying to find leverage against the dense, solid muscle underneath. It was a pathetic, deeply revealing display. Here was a man who had spent his entire life bullying subordinates in boardrooms using financial leverage to force compliance. He was completely unequipped to handle physical defiance. He yanked again, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson veins bulging along his neck. "Are you out of your mind?" Harrison spat, his voice a harsh, venomous whisper designed to avoid alerting the wealthy guests just beyond the doors. "I gave you a direct order. I told you to put on the black suit and stay out of sight. You are actively trying to destroy your sister's special day." I looked down at his trembling hands gripping my arm. I did not flex. I did not push him away. I simply allowed him to exert his futile energy, watching him exhaust himself against a wall of pure, tactical discipline. In the field, an unprovoked physical escalation from an adversary is met with immediate, overwhelming force. But Harrison was not an enemy combatant. He was just a small, insecure man terrified of losing a business deal. The most devastating response I could offer was absolute, unyielding stillness. Harrison finally let go of my arm, stepping back and wiping a hand across his sweating forehead. His chest heaved as he pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "Listen to me very carefully." He seethed, his eyes wide with a manic, desperate energy. "You are going to turn around right now. You are going to march back to that service closet, and you are going to take off this ridiculous costume. You will remove every single one of those fake, flashy pins. You will put the rental suit back on, or you will pack your bags and leave the premises immediately." Brittany nodded vigorously behind him, a smug, triumphant smile returning to her face now that she had her primary enforcer backing her up. "If you step 1 foot into that ballroom looking like this," Harrison continued, his voice dripping with absolute malice, "I will signal the country club security detail. I have already paid them a massive premium for tonight. I will instruct them to physically restrain you and throw you out into the street. I will tell Jamal parents that you are a disgruntled, unstable, estranged relative who crashed the venue. I will ruin you, Ryan. I will make sure you never show your face in our social circles again." He took another step forward, trying to use his proximity to establish dominance. $25 million, Harrison hissed, slamming his fist into his open palm for emphasis. "That is the defense contract I am finalizing tonight. That contract secures this family legacy for generations. I am not going to let a stubborn, selfish grunt ruin my negotiations because he wants to play dress-up and pretend he is important. You are nothing compared to the people in that room. You have zero power here. You are either going to submit to my rules or you are going to be escorted out like the trash you are. Take off the uniform, Ryan. That is my final warning." The corridor fell dead silent. Brittany crossed her arms, waiting for my inevitable submission. The bridesmaids held their breath. Harrison glared at me, his chest puffed out fully, believing he had just delivered a checkmate. I looked at my father. I did not raise an eyebrow. I did not blink. I deployed a stare of absolute, chilling, deadpan silence. It was the exact same flat, predatory gaze I utilized when interrogating high-value targets who believed they held the upper hand right before the reality of their situation collapsed around them. I stared through his bluster, through his expensive suit, through his pathetic corporate threats. I looked directly into the hollow, fragile core of his ego. The silence stretched out thick and suffocating. It lasted 5 seconds, then 10, then 15. I did not offer a single syllable of defense. I did not justify the medals on my chest. I did not explain that the security team he threatened to call would likely stand down the moment they recognized my rank. I simply let the crushing weight of my silence press down on him. Harrison's arrogant posture began to fracture. The supreme confidence he had projected mere moments ago faltered under my unwavering ice-cold scrutiny. He shifted his weight uncomfortably. His eyes darted away from mine for a fraction of a second, a primal instinct kicking in as his brain registered that he was standing in front of a highly lethal apex predator who was entirely unfazed by his aggression. A bead of sweat rolled down the side of his face. He swallowed hard, the silence becoming unbearable for him. I maintained the stare for 5 more seconds, ensuring he felt the full, terrifying spectrum of his own powerlessness. He had issued his final warning. He had no idea I was simply waiting for the operational clock to strike. I broke the visual lock. I did not blink, nor did I lower my chin in submission. I simply shifted my gaze smoothly past Harrison's sweating forehead and turned my body 45 degrees to the right. Stepping back, I put an additional 3 feet of space between us. It was a deliberate, calculated retreat. In close quarters combat, you create distance to draw the enemy into an exposed position. In this corridor, I created distance to let my father believe his pathetic threats had actually landed a blow. Harrison exhaled a sharp, jagged breath. His shoulders slumped a fraction of an inch as the crushing pressure of my silence lifted off his chest. He immediately tried to recover his shattered dignity by adjusting his expensive suit jacket and shooting a triumphant look at my sister. Brittany smirked, crossing her arms over her lavish $40,000 gown. They genuinely thought my physical retreat was a surrender. They thought I had backed down to save my own skin from their country club security guards. I turned completely away from them and began walking down the corridor toward the heavy service doors. I did not rush. My stride remained measured, perfectly paced, the polished soles of my uniform shoes sinking silently into the expensive floral carpet. Behind me, I could hear Harrison muttering to Brittany, telling her to fix her makeup and get back into the ballroom before Jamal's parents noticed her absence. Their footsteps echoed in the opposite direction, retreating to the safety of their superficial corporate mingling. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors that led into the staging area just outside the main ballroom. The air here was frantic. Catering staff rushed past carrying heavy silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and gourmet appetizers. The noise level was deafening, a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence of the hallway I had just left. I found a quiet corner near a stack of spare banquet chairs and stood at parade rest, allowing the chaotic civilian energy to flow around me without disturbing my focus. A sharp, singular vibration buzzed against my right thigh. This was not the heavy double pulse of my encrypted tactical device. This was my standard civilian smartphone. I reached into my trouser pocket and retrieved the device. The screen lit up, displaying a new text message notification. The sender was listed simply as Harrison. I unlocked the screen and opened the message thread. The text was short, vicious, and entirely devoid of any parental affection. No one cares about your Navy career. Go sit at the vendor table near the kitchen or leave. You are embarrassing us. I stared at the glowing pixels on the screen. The sheer audacity of the message was almost impressive. My father had just formally ordered a decorated Tier 1 commander to hide with the hired help because the sight of my combat medals was deemed a social liability. He had put his ultimate insult into writing, creating a permanent, undeniable digital record of his own arrogance. He was handing me the exact ammunition I needed for the inevitable fallout. My tactical training dictated that every piece of actionable intelligence must be preserved. I pressed the side buttons on my phone simultaneously. The screen flashed white, capturing a high-resolution screenshot of the message. I immediately synced the image to a secure cloud server, ensuring that even if my physical device was compromised or destroyed, Harrison's words would survive. That single text message was the final nail in his coffin. I tapped the reply field. I did not type out an angry paragraph. I did not demand respect or threaten to expose his massive defense contract grift. Emotional responses yield tactical disadvantages. An enemy who believes they are in absolute control is an enemy who makes fatal operational errors. I needed Harrison to feel completely secure in his false victory. I needed him to walk into that ballroom with his chest puffed out, fully convinced that he had successfully dominated the situation and crushed my spirit. I typed two simple, universally understood words, Roger that. I hit send. The message bubble turned blue, indicating successful delivery. It was the perfect response. In military communication, it simply signifies that an order has been received and understood. It does not imply agreement, respect, or surrender. It just confirms the transmission. But to a civilian narcissist like Harrison, those two words would read like total capitulation. He would look at his phone, see my brief response, and assume I was dutifully marching to the back of the room with my tail tucked between my legs. I slid the phone back into my pocket, the cold metal casing resting against my leg. The board was set. The pieces were locked into their final positions. I stepped out of the staging area and navigated through a narrow service hallway that bypassed the main guest entrance, leading directly into the rear of the grand ballroom. I emerged from behind a massive floral partition right next to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. The ballroom was spectacular, bathed in the warm golden light of massive crystal chandeliers. Hundreds of wealthy guests mingled in their designer evening wear, completely unaware of the tension simmering just beneath the surface of the event. At the very back of the room, positioned deliberately behind a large structural pillar and dangerously close to the noisy kitchen doors, was a single undecorated round table. It was stripped bare of the expensive silk centerpieces and crystal glassware that adorned the guest tables. It held only a stack of spare napkins, a few plastic water pitchers, and a scattered pile of vendor schedules. This was the designated area for the hired photographers, the wedding planners, and the audio technicians to grab a quick, unseen meal during the reception. I walked straight toward it. I pulled out a cheap, flimsy plastic folding chair that scraped loudly against the marble floor. I sat down, keeping my back perfectly straight, my shoulders squared, and my hands resting flat on my thighs. The heavy wool of my dress blues contrasted violently with the barren utilitarian setting of the vendor table. The gleaming gold buttons and the brilliant cluster of my combat medals caught the ambient light, creating a surreal visual disconnect. A young catering assistant rushing out of the kitchen with a tray of empty glasses nearly tripped over her own feet when she saw me. She stared at my uniform, her eyes wide with shock and profound confusion. She recognized instantly that a high-ranking military officer did not belong at the trash table. She opened her mouth to speak, likely to offer me a better seat or fetch a manager, but I gave her a polite, reassuring nod. I silently raised my hand, signaling for her to continue her duties without intervening. She hurried away, casting nervous glances over her shoulder. I reached for one of the plastic pitchers and poured myself a glass of room-temperature water. I took a slow, measured sip, letting the cheap plastic rim rest against my lips. I settled back into the flimsy chair, allowing my vision to sweep the massive ballroom. Far across the room near the VIP tables, I spotted Harrison. He was holding a glass of expensive champagne, laughing loudly with a group of corporate executives, his posture radiating unchecked arrogance. He glanced briefly toward the back of the room, spotting my dark uniform half hidden by the structural pillar. A smug, satisfied smirk spread across his face before he turned back to his wealthy audience. I did not react. I simply watched him celebrate his hollow victory. I checked my internal operational clock. The heavy armored vehicles carrying Admiral Winston and my 30 SEAL brothers were already passing through the main gates of the country club. The countdown had officially reached 0. The explosive payload was primed and Harrison was standing directly on the blast radius. The string quartet positioned on the elevated mahogany stage shifted their tempo. The light, airy classical notes that had served as background noise for the wealthy elite suddenly transitioned into a more deliberate, resonant melody before fading out entirely. Event coordinators scurried along the edges of the marble floor, frantically whispering into their concealed earpieces, their faces pale with sudden anxiety. A hush began to ripple outward from the grand entrance, spreading like a physical wave across the sprawling gilded ballroom. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes ceased. The loud, arrogant laughter of corporate executives died in their throats. The collective attention of hundreds of billionaires, powerful senators, and elite socialites was magnetically pulled toward the massive double oak doors at the front of the hall. From my isolated plastic chair by the swinging kitchen doors, I maintained my absolute disciplined stillness. I watched the scene unfold with the detached precision of a sniper looking through a high-powered optic. The doors did not just open, they were thrust apart simultaneously by two massive, unsmiling federal security agents wearing dark suits and earpieces. The heavy oak panels hit the wall stops with a resounding heavy thud that echoed sharply in the sudden, suffocating quiet of the room. Admiral Winston stepped over the threshold. The sheer, undeniable aura of authority that radiated from the man was physically staggering. He did not simply walk into the room. He took absolute command of it without uttering a single syllable. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, his posture forged by decades of crushing responsibility and global tactical command. He was wearing his Navy service dress blues, but his uniform carried a weight that eclipsed every other person in the building. 4 solid silver stars gleamed brilliantly on his collar, signifying the absolute pinnacle of military achievement. The left breast of his jacket was a vibrant, massive block of combat decorations, campaign ribbons, and service medals that told the story of a lifetime spent defending the free world. He was flanked by a formidable entourage of high-ranking military aides. 2 Navy captains walked exactly half a pace behind him, their own uniforms immaculate, their expressions carved from stone. 2 more federal security agents secured the rear formation, their eyes scanning the crowd with lethal efficiency. They moved as a single impenetrable unit, cutting through the lavish, superficial wealth of the country club, like a heavily armored battleship cutting through still water. The reaction from Jamal's extended family was immediate and profound. The defense contracting billionaires, the men and women who wielded massive financial influence across the globe, instantly straightened their postures. They recognized exactly what Admiral Winston represented. He was not just a guest at a rehearsal dinner. He was a living institution. The easy, relaxed atmosphere of the lavish party evaporated instantly, replaced by an atmosphere of deep, reverent respect. Even the most powerful corporate titans in the room visibly deferred to the 4-star commander. I shifted my gaze to track my biological father. Harrison was standing near the center of the room, positioned perfectly to intercept the new arrivals. His reaction was a masterclass in pathetic, transparent greed. The moment his eyes locked onto the 4 silver stars, his entire body seemed to vibrate with desperate, unchecked ambition. He aggressively smoothed the lapels of his expensive designer suit, trying to project an air of equal importance. He shot a frantic, commanding look at my mother, Brenda, who quickly adjusted her posture and pasted on her most obsequious, welcoming smile. Brittany, standing near the towering wedding cake display, actually gasped, her eyes widening as she realized the true magnitude of the guests she was hosting. They thought this was their crowning moment. They truly believed that this 4-star admiral, this titan of military strategy, had arrived simply to bless their daughter's wedding and hand over a lucrative $25 million defense contract. They were operating under the profound delusion that their country club membership and leased luxury vehicles somehow placed them on equal footing with a man who dictated the movements of aircraft carriers and entire naval fleets. Admiral Winston paused just inside the entrance, the grand chandelier casting sharp shadows across his weathered face. He slowly swept his gaze across the sea of tailored suits and designer gowns. His eyes were cold, analytical, assessing the tactical layout of the ballroom in a fraction of a second. The silence in the room was absolute. Nobody dared to speak. Nobody dared to step forward and break the unwritten protocol of his arrival. Except, of course, for Harrison. Driven by a blinding toxic combination of arrogance and financial desperation, my father broke ranks. He stepped out from the polished crowd, entirely ignoring the rigid social boundaries established by Jamal's family. Harrison began marching directly toward the admiral, his face stretched into a sickeningly eager, desperate grin. He was preparing to launch into his rehearsed corporate pitch, ready to leverage his daughter's wedding as a cheap transactional networking opportunity. I remained seated at the vendor table, my hands resting flat against my thighs. My breathing was slow, deliberate, and measured. The cheap plastic chair offered no support, but my spine was perfectly aligned in a rigid posture. I was completely hidden in the shadows of the structural pillar, a silent observer to the impending catastrophic collision. The heavy wool of my own dress blues felt grounded and secure against my skin. The metals on my chest caught the faint flickering light of a nearby exit sign, a quiet testament to the reality my family was desperately trying to bury. Admiral Winston's aides immediately tensed as Harrison aggressively approached their body language, shifting into a subtle but undeniable defensive posture. The security agents at the rear of the formation subtly adjusted their stances, their hands resting closer to their concealed weapons. They recognized a disruption in the protocol, a chaotic, unvetted variable, advancing rapidly toward their principal protectee. Jamal, standing near the front of the room, closed his eyes for a brief, agonizing second. He knew exactly what Harrison was doing, and the sheer embarrassment radiating from the groom was palpable even from my distant, shadowed vantage point. Jamal's father, the patriarch of the massive defense empire, simply stared at Harrison with an expression of cold, unyielding judgment. The string quartet had stopped playing entirely. The only sound in the massive, opulent ballroom was the rapid, eager clicking of Harrison's expensive leather shoes, striking the marble floor as he closed the distance toward the most powerful man in the room. The operational window was closing rapidly. The initial contact was about to be made. I kept my eyes locked on the interaction, my heart rate steady, waiting for the precise moment the illusion would shatter completely. Harrison was entirely oblivious to the gravity of his own error. He stepped directly into the center aisle, placing himself squarely in the trajectory of a man who commanded entire oceanic fleets. The aggressive, eager grin plastered across my father's face was a grotesque display of corporate desperation. He thrust his right hand forward, his expensive gold watch catching the chandelier light, attempting to force a physical interaction that had not been cleared, vetted, or invited. Admiral Winston Harrison boomed his voice, shattering the reverent silence of the grand ballroom. The sheer volume of his greeting made several prominent guests physically wince. "I am Harrison, the father of the bride. We are absolutely thrilled to welcome you to our celebration. I have been coordinating with your civilian liaisons regarding the $25 million logistics contract, and I wanted to personally assure you that my firm is fully prepared to optimize your supply chains." It was a catastrophic social miscalculation. Pitching a multi-million-dollar defense contract at a rehearsal dinner was vulgar. Doing it while physically blocking a four-star admiral who had just entered the room was an act of profound, arrogant stupidity. I watched from the shadows of the vendor table, my breathing slow and steady. I analyzed the micro-expressions of the people surrounding the impact zone. Jamal closed his eyes, a muscle in his jaw ticking furiously as the humiliation of his future father-in-law washed over him. Jamal's father, David, narrowed his eyes into dangerous, unforgiving slits. Brenda and Brittany, however, leaned forward with greedy anticipation, utterly convinced that Harrison's aggressive networking was about to secure their royal status among the billionaire elite. They were tragically wrong. Admiral Winston did not slow his pace. He did not extend his hand. He did not even offer a polite, dismissive nod. His weathered, battle-hardened face remained an impenetrable mask of absolute authority. He looked right through Harrison, as if my father were entirely transparent, treating the sweating, desperate businessman like a minor atmospheric disturbance that did not warrant a fraction of his attention. The tactical response from the Admiral's security detail was flawless. The two Navy captains flanking Winston did not shout or cause a scene. They executed a seamless, highly rehearsed blocking maneuver. As Harrison stepped forward, The captain on the right simply shifted his broad shoulders and extended a rigid forearm, creating an immovable physical barrier. Harrison collided with the captain's arm and bounced back, his expensive leather shoes scrambling for traction on the polished marble floor. The entire formation moved past my father without breaking their stride. They left Harrison stranded in the middle of the aisle, his right hand still awkwardly extended into the empty air. A collective silent gasp rippled through the gathered crowd of senators, defense contractors, and socialites. They were witnessing a brutal, surgical, social execution. Harrison's smile melted off his face, replaced by a sickly ashen pallor, as the crushing reality of the snub settled over him. He lowered his hand, his fingers twitching, completely emasculated in front of the exact people he had spent a fortune trying to impress. I remained perfectly still in my flimsy plastic chair. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply observed the battlefield. Harrison had demanded I hide in the back because he believed my military career was an embarrassment. Now he was the one standing alone, publicly humiliated by the very institution he had mocked. Admiral Winston reached the center of the grand ballroom and halted. His security detail immediately fanned out, securing the perimeter with quiet, lethal efficiency. The room remained paralyzed. Nobody moved toward the buffet. Nobody signaled the string quartet to resume playing. The sheer gravitational pull of the admiral commanded absolute compliance. Winston did not look at the towering multi-thousand-dollar wedding cake. He did not acknowledge the lavish floral arches or the ice sculptures that Brenda had obsessed over for months. He ignored the prominent politicians hovering near the VIP tables. His eyes cold and sharp as polished steel began to sweep the massive room. From my concealed vantage point behind the structural pillar, I recognized the visual pattern immediately. It was a standard high-level threat assessment scan. Winston was evaluating the environment, breaking the room down into quadrants, prioritizing exits, blind spots, and shadowed corners. He was not looking for a wealthy defense contractor or a politician to shake hands with. He was hunting for a specific target. His gaze swept past the front tables, dismissing the eager, wealthy faces looking back at him. He scanned the middle rows, his eyes moving with methodical, thermal-like precision. I tracked his line of sight, knowing exactly what he was searching for. He was looking for the man who had pulled his son out of a burning compound in Fallujah. He was looking for the operator who had refused to leave a man behind even when the extraction helicopter was taking heavy enemy fire. Brenda, desperately trying to salvage the catastrophic failure of her husband, attempted to step forward from her table. She smoothed down her sequined gown and plastered on a frantic smile, clearly intending to intercept the admiral and redirect his attention to Brittany. But one of the federal security agents caught her eye and delivered a single freezing glare that stopped her dead in her tracks. She shrank back into her seat, her materialistic courage instantly evaporating under the weight of genuine federal authority. Admiral Winston's gaze reached the back quadrant of the ballroom. His eyes passed over the swinging kitchen doors, the stacked banquet chairs, and the frantic catering staff huddled in the corner. Then his scanning pattern stopped. His eyes locked onto the deep shadows behind the structural pillar. They locked onto the single undecorated plastic table. They locked onto the stark dark wool of my navy dress blues and the brilliant unmistakable gleam of the silver star and the navy cross anchored to my chest. I did not break visual contact. I sat with my back perfectly straight, my hands resting flat on my thighs, projecting the absolute discipline of a Tier 1 commander. The distance between us was over 50 yards, a sea of bewildered billionaires and stunned socialites separating us. But the connection was instantaneous and profound. It was a silent transmission of absolute recognition between two men who understood the extreme, unforgiving cost of the medals I wore. The air in the ballroom grew impossibly heavy. The wealthy elite, noticing the sudden laser-focused direction of the admiral's stare, began to slowly turn their heads. Hundreds of confused, highly influential guests shifted their attention away from the lavish VIP section and toward the barren, hidden corner of the room. Harrison, still standing frozen in the aisle, turned his head to follow the admiral's gaze, his face contorting in sheer, unadulterated panic as he realized exactly where Winston was looking. The countdown was over. The payload was about to detonate. The sheer gravity of Admiral Winston's unbroken stare acted as a silent, invisible laser designator, cutting straight across the lavish ballroom. His eyes remained locked on my dark uniform, anchoring the tension in the room to a single localized point. But the Admiral had not arrived at this country club alone. Embedded seamlessly within the sea of wealthy politicians, corporate executives, and socialites were 30 highly specialized individuals. They wore bespoke tailored suits that rivaled the imported Italian wool worn by the billionaires surrounding them. Harrison had likely spent the entire evening assuming these men were junior defense contractors or private security executives working under Jamal's family empire. My father had probably handed them business cards completely oblivious to the lethal reality sitting right at his own tables. These 30 men were not corporate analysts. They were Echo Squadron. They were my brothers. They were the most heavily decorated, battle-hardened Tier 1 operators in the United States military arsenal. And up until this exact fraction of a second, they had perfectly maintained their deep cover, blending into the opulent background with the quiet, unassuming discipline of apex predators resting in the brush. Lieutenant Decker sat at table 4, positioned just a few yards away from where my mother Brenda was sitting paralyzed in her chair. Decker and I had breached compounds together in pitch-black combat zones. He was a man who communicated in micro-expressions and tactical awareness. When Admiral Winston stopped dead in the center aisle, Decker immediately recognized the disruption in the operational protocol. He tracked the 4-star Admiral's line of sight. His sharp, calculating eyes swept past the towering floral arrangements, past the horrified face of my father, and landed squarely on the darkened corner by the kitchen swinging doors. Decker spotted the flimsy plastic chair. He saw the barren, undecorated vendor table. He registered the heavy, unmistakable navy wool of my dress blues and the brilliant flash of the silver star pinned to my chest. He instantly processed the catastrophic disrespect that had been inflicted upon his commanding officer. I watched a dangerous, razor-sharp shadow pass over Decker's face. The polite conversational smile he had been offering to a nearby socialite vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of absolute unforgiving military discipline. He did not ask for permission. He did not hesitate to shatter the refined country club atmosphere. Decker pushed his chair back. The heavy wooden legs scraped violently against the polished marble floor, creating a harsh grating sound that ripped through the suffocating silence of the ballroom. He stood up, squaring his massive shoulders, his posture snapping into a flawless position of attention. In the world of special warfare, communication does not require radios or shouted commands when a unit operates with a hive mind synchronization. The second Decker moved, the ambient tactical pressure in the room shifted. The other 29 operators seated throughout the grand hall felt the sudden aggressive change in the environment. Like a pack of wolves reacting to a silent signal, their heads snapped in Decker's direction. They traced his visual target line. One by one, their eyes landed on the shadowed corner. They saw their commander, the man who had brought them home alive from the most dangerous deployments on Earth, relegated to sit with the trash by a family of arrogant, superficial civilians. The reaction was instantaneous, unified, and utterly terrifying in its precision. Without a single word being spoken, all 30 men abandoned their civilian covers. They ceased being polite wedding guests and instantly reverted to the most lethal fighting force on the planet. They stood up. They did not rise casually or awkwardly. 30 massive, incredibly fit men surged to their feet in absolute flawless unison. The synchronized movement was so sudden and so physically overwhelming that several wealthy guests seated next to them actually gasped and pulled away in sheer shock. Champagne flutes tipped over, spilling expensive liquid across the silk tablecloths, but the operators did not even glance down. Their eyes were locked entirely on me. They turned their bodies to face the back of the room, aligning themselves in perfect military formation, despite being scattered across the civilian tables. The sheer physical presence of 30 Tier 1 operators standing at strict attention completely hijacked the oxygen in the ballroom. Then came the sound. 30 pairs of polished leather dress shoes snapped together at the exact same millisecond. The heavy synchronized impact of their heels striking the imported marble floor generated a sharp, violent crack. The noise detonated in the dead silence of the ballroom. It echoed off the vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers with the concussive force of a gunshot. Several guests physically flinched, their hands jumping to their chests as the acoustic shockwave rolled through the room. The deafening crack of their heels was followed by an immediate breathless vacuum. The entire country club was paralyzed. Lieutenant Decker filled his lungs. He bypassed every social convention, every ounce of polite country club etiquette, and unleashed a combat-level command that tore through the opulent space with earth-shattering volume. "Admiral on deck." The shout was deafening. It roared over the heads of the billionaires and politicians, commanding absolute, unquestioning submission from every single soul in the building. The civilian crowd was thrown into a state of profound psychological chaos. The wealthy guests darted their eyes back and forth in frantic confusion. They knew Admiral Winston was standing in the center aisle. They expected the four-star military titan to turn around to acknowledge the command to take ownership of the room. But Admiral Winston did not move a single muscle. He remained perfectly rigid, his back straight, his eyes still locked on my shadowed table. By refusing to accept the honorific, the four-star admiral confirmed a reality that broke the minds of everyone watching. The shout was not for him. In the highly classified circles of naval special warfare, ranks and names are often replaced by operational call signs. The men of Echo Squadron did not call me commander. They called me the Admiral. It was a title earned through tactical genius, and spilled blood, a title that carried more weight among these 30 men than any brass pin issued by the Pentagon. Jamal's father, David, stood at his VIP table, his eyes widening in profound realization. As a man deeply entrenched in the highest levels of the defense industry, he knew the legend of the Fallujah extraction. He knew the mythic call sign of the operator who executed it. David slowly turned his head, his gaze bypassing my frozen, terrified father, looking directly at the plastic table by the kitchen doors. Harrison completely collapsed inward. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked as though he had been physically struck. His mouth hung open in a grotesque, silent scream of pure terror. He slowly turned his head, tracing the unified, unwavering salute of 30 elite soldiers. He followed the line of their respect right back to the cheap vendor table where he had ordered me to hide. Near the wedding cake, Brittany dropped her crystal champagne flute. The expensive glass shattered into 100 pieces on the marble floor, but nobody even glanced in her direction. Her $40,000 dress meant absolutely nothing. The $25 million contract meant nothing. The entire military apparatus in the room, from the four-star admiral to the 30 lethal operators, was standing at absolute rigid attention, rendering the highest possible military honor to the man my family had just treated like a disposable peasant. The profound silence reigning over the grand ballroom was broken only by the sharp, deliberate sound of Admiral Winston stepping forward. The four-star commander moved with a measured, unstoppable momentum. He did not veer toward the lavishly decorated VIP section. He did not cast a single glance at the towering wedding cake or the weeping ice sculptures that my mother had spent a fortune to secure. He completely bypassed the cluster of state senators and defense contractors who had spent the entire evening attempting to curry favor with his family. Harrison stood paralyzed in the center aisle. His mouth hung slightly open, his breath coming in shallow, erratic gasps. As Admiral Winston approached, my father instinctively shrank back, attempting to fold his trembling frame into the safety of the crowd. He looked like a man realizing he had just stepped onto an active landmine. The Admiral walked right past him. Winston did not even acknowledge Harrison's existence, treating him as nothing more than empty space. The physical dismissal was absolute. Harrison slumped against a velvet-backed chair, the blood entirely drained from his face as he watched the most powerful man in the room walk away from him. Brittany remained frozen near the catering doors. The shards of her shattered champagne flute sparkled on the marble floor around her expensive designer heels. She stared at the advancing admiral, her eyes wide with a frantic, uncomprehending panic. She had spent months crafting an immaculate, superficial narrative of her own supreme importance. Now the absolute pinnacle of the military and defense hierarchy was marching past her $40,000 wedding dress without offering it a fraction of a second of attention. The spotlight she so desperately craved had shifted permanently, illuminating the very man she had tried to erase. The path to the back of the room was long, cutting across the entire expanse of the country club floor. Every eye in the building tracked Admiral Winston's progress. Jamal stood with his father David near the head table. The groom and the billionaire defense contractor watched the unfolding scene with profound clarity. They saw the 30 Tier 1 operators holding their rigid, unwavering salutes. They saw the 4-star commander navigating the room with singular purpose. They understood the extreme gravity of the moment. David slowly lowered his chin in a gesture of profound, silent respect, acknowledging the heavy burden of combat leadership that was currently commanding the room. I remained seated in my flimsy plastic chair at the vendor table. I did not rush to stand. I maintained the disciplined, terrifying calm that had kept me alive in the most hostile environments on Earth. My hands rested flat on my thighs. The harsh fluorescent light from the swinging kitchen doors spilled over my shoulder, catching the gold buttons of my dress blues and illuminating the silver star on my chest. The stark, barren reality of the trash table my father had assigned to me contrasted violently with the immense historic honor marching in my direction. Admiral Winston finally reached the back of the ballroom. He stopped exactly 3 feet away from my cheap, unadorned table. His 2 Navy captain aides halted perfectly in step behind him, their expressions carved from granite. The federal security agents secured the immediate perimeter, their eyes scanning the stunned crowd to ensure no civilian dared to interrupt the sacred exchange about to occur. The admiral looked down at me. The harsh lines of his face, weathered by decades of global command and unimaginable stress, softened marginally. I saw the deep, undeniable exhaustion of a father who had almost lost his child to the brutal machinery of war. His eyes swept over the combat decorations anchored to my chest. He recognized the heavy metallic weight of the Navy Cross. He understood the agonizing physical and psychological cost of the Purple Heart resting beside it. I placed my hands on the plastic armrests of the folding chair. I engaged my core, pushing my weight upward, and stood to my full height. I squared my shoulders perfectly, aligning my frame with the 4-star commander standing before me. The height difference was negligible, but the power dynamic was historically rigid. A commander does not stand on equal footing with an admiral of the Joint Chiefs. Yet in this shadowed corner of a superficial country club, the standard military hierarchy was temporarily suspended by a debt of blood. Admiral Winston brought his right hand up in a crisp, razor-sharp salute. The motion was executed with flawless mechanical precision, the fabric of his dark sleeve snapping tight. It was not a casual greeting. It was the highest, most profound gesture of military respect a superior officer could render to a subordinate. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. The billionaires, the politicians, the socialites, and my terrified biological family watched in total, paralyzing shock. They were witnessing a 4-star military titan initiating a salute to a man they had been told was a worthless, low-paying government worker. "It is an honor to finally meet you in person," Commander Admiral Winston said. His voice was deep, commanding, and projected with deliberate force. It echoed across the marble floor, rolling over the silent crowd, and slamming directly into the ears of my horrified family. Every single word was articulated with absolute clarity, designed to be heard by every wealthy defense contractor and corporate executive in the building. "Thank you for bringing my son home alive from Fallujah." The words detonated in the grand ballroom. The impact was physically palpable. A collective gasp rippled through the elite crowd. The wealthy guests suddenly understood the true, terrifying magnitude of the situation. They were not looking at a mere soldier. They were looking at a Tier 1 tactical legend who had executed an impossible extraction under heavy enemy fire to save the son of the most powerful military commander on the East Coast. I raised my right arm, snapping off a flawless mirror, perfect salute in return. My hand rested just above my brow, my fingers straight and rigid. The gesture was absolute, sealing the unspoken bond forged in the darkest theaters of modern combat. The country club, with all its superficial wealth, fake prestige, and pathetic social climbing, completely ceased to exist. In this exact moment, there was only the admiral, the 30 elite operators standing at attention behind him, and the profound, unbreakable brotherhood of the uniform. I held the salute for 3 full seconds, acknowledging the immense weight of the gesture. Admiral Winston lowered his hand with crisp, deliberate precision. I mirrored the movement instantly, my arms snapping back to my side, resting flush against the dark wool of my trousers. The immediate physical protocol was complete, but the psychological warfare in the room had just reached its absolute peak. The silence in the grand ballroom was no longer just quiet. It was a dense, suffocating vacuum. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents and the shallow, terrified breathing of the guests closest to the epicenter. "It is good to see you," Commander Admiral Winston said, his voice lowering to a conversational yet intensely commanding register. "My team informed me you were in the building. I fully expected to see you at the front entrance." I maintained my rigid posture, my eyes locked on the 4-star legend standing before me. I did not raise my voice, but I calibrated the acoustics of my response perfectly. I projected my words from my diaphragm, ensuring that the sound carried effortlessly across the marble floor, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings, and cutting straight through the dead air of the country club. "I would have greeted you at the door, sir," I stated with icy, lethal precision. "But my family informed me my military career is an embarrassment and ordered me to sit with the trash." The words did not just hang in the air, they detonated. The sheer, unadulterated brutality of the statement sent a physical shockwave through the room. It was a tactical precision strike aimed directly at the fragile, fabricated facade my biological father had spent his entire life building. I did not sugarcoat the reality. I did not protect their delicate social sensibilities. I laid their toxic, materialistic arrogance bare for the absolute highest echelon of the American defense industry to witness. Admiral Winston's expression instantly darkened. The faint, respectful warmth that had softened his battle-hardened features vanished, replaced by a storm of cold, unyielding fury. The muscles in his jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed into dangerous slits as he slowly turned his head to survey the room. He was a man who commanded hundreds of thousands of troops, a man who understood the profound sacrifice required to wear the medals on my chest. To hear that the man who had dragged his bleeding son out of a burning compound in Fallujah was treated like disposable garbage by a group of superficial civilians was an insult he would never forgive. Behind the admiral, the 2 Navy captains visibly stiffened their expressions, hardening into masks of absolute disgust. Spread across the ballroom, the 30 Tier 1 operators of Echo Squadron remained standing at attention, but the ambient temperature around them seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Their collective stare shifted from me toward the center aisle, locking onto the sweating, trembling figure of my father. 30 highly trained apex predators were now visually targeting the man who had insulted their commanding officer. Near the VIP tables, Jamal and his father David heard every single syllable. The reaction from the billionaire defense contractors was instantaneous and utterly devastating. David, a man whose entire corporate empire was built on a foundation of deep military respect, looked as though he had just been handed a live grenade. The polite, restrained composure he had maintained all evening shattered. His face hardened into a mask of pure, uncompromising revulsion. He slowly turned his head to look at Harrison. It was not a look of disappointment. It was the look a man gives to a cockroach right before he crushes it beneath his heel. Jamal stepped away from the head table. The groom who had spent the entire day trying to give my family the benefit of the doubt, who had invited me for a drink, only to watch my father verbally abuse me in the driveway, finally understood the complete, horrific picture. Jamal looked at his bride. Brittany was standing frozen near the shattered remains of her champagne flute, her $40,000 dress pooling around her like a deflated parachute. Jamal's eyes swept over her, stripped of all affection and warmth. He saw the ugly, narcissistic truth hiding beneath the expensive makeup and designer fabric. In the center aisle, Harrison's psychological collapse was absolute. The blood had entirely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His knees buckled slightly, unable to support the sudden crushing weight of his catastrophic failure. He reached out a trembling hand, grabbing the back of a velvet chair to keep from collapsing onto the marble floor. His mouth opened and closed in a pathetic silent loop. He wanted to speak. He wanted to deploy his usual corporate spin to weave a lie that would save his precious $25 million contract. But there were no lies left to tell. The truth was standing in front of him, flanked by federal security agents and a four-star admiral. Harrison realized in that agonizing, breathless moment that his superficial wealth was entirely meaningless. His country club memberships and his leased luxury vehicles had zero currency in a room commanded by honor and spilled blood. He had banished his son to the shadows to protect an investment, and in doing so, he had actively incinerated his entire financial future. Brenda remained glued to her chair, her hands clamped over her mouth to stifle a horrified sob. She looked wildly around the room, making eye contact with the wealthy socialites she had spent hours trying to impress. Instead of admiration, she found only disgust and profound social ostracization. She had traded her son for a fraction of social status, and now she was left with absolutely nothing. The silence stretched on, heavy and unforgiving. I remained standing at the vendor table, my posture flawless, my breathing slow and regulated. I simply allowed the toxic manufactured world my family had built to crumble into dust around them. They had spent their entire lives treating me like a bad investment. They had finally run out of equity. Admiral Winston slowly turned his attention back to me. The cold fury in his eyes receded slightly, replaced by a look of profound, unwavering solidarity. He gave a sharp, decisive nod, a silent confirmation that the battlefield had been entirely secured. The operation was a complete, devastating success. David moved. The patriarch of the defense contracting empire stepped away from the VYP table, his footsteps echoing with the same heavy, ominous weight as the federal agents who had just secured the room. He did not rush. He walked down the center aisle with the terrifying, unhurried pace of an executioner who already knew the verdict. Harrison, still clutching the back of the velvet chair to keep his knees from buckling, watched David approach. A pathetic, desperate glimmer of hope flickered in my father's panicked eyes. He mistakenly believed that a fellow businessman might somehow salvage this absolute disaster, that money might still speak louder than the rigid military code currently strangling the room. "David, please." Harrison choked out his voice, cracking into a high, reedy whine. "This is just a massive misunderstanding. Ryan has a very stressful job, and we simply thought he needed a quiet place to decompress tonight. The contract, the logistics framework we discussed earlier, we are still completely aligned on that. I can have the final paperwork on your desk by Monday morning." David stopped 2 feet away from Harrison. He did not look at the sweating, trembling man with anger. He looked at him with clinical, uncompromising revulsion. "We spent the last 6 months vetting your company, Harrison." David stated, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that carried no warmth whatsoever. "We analyzed your supply chains, your financial projections, and your corporate infrastructure. You passed the paper audit. But my family's empire was not built on paper. It was built by men who took oaths to defend this nation. It is sustained by the blood, sweat, and absolute integrity of warfighters, exactly like the commander sitting behind you." Harrison swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat dripping off his chin and splashing onto his expensive silk tie. "I thought you were a man of substance," David continued, his tone dropping to a lethal, icy whisper that somehow commanded the entire ballroom. "But you are nothing but a hollow, opportunistic coward. You forced a decorated Tier 1 operator, a man who wears the Navy Cross, to hide in the shadows because you thought his service was an eyesore. You treated your own blood like garbage to secure a financial transaction." David did not raise his voice yet. The absolute finality of his next words struck like a physical blow. "The $25 million logistics contract is permanently terminated," David announced, delivering the financial slaughter with ruthless efficiency. "We do not do business with people who spit on the men bleeding for this country. Do not ever contact my firm again. Your company is blacklisted across our entire network, effective immediately." Harrison physically crumpled his knees, finally giving out as he sank against the velvet chair. His entire corporate future, his carefully constructed social standing, and his fragile ego were entirely incinerated in front of the most powerful people on the East Coast. Harrison scrambled up from the floor, his chest heaving, as the absolute devastation of his ruined empire crashed down on him. Raw, unadulterated panic completely overrode his pride. He stumbled down the aisle toward my table, followed closely by Brenda and Brittany, who were both sobbing in a frantic display of desperation. They surrounded my plastic chair, their hands reaching out to grab my uniform, but the federal agents took a sharp step forward, stopping them cold. Harrison dropped to his knees right there on the marble floor. "Ryan, please," Harrison begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "You have to fix this. Tell them it was a joke. Tell the Admiral we are a good family. We are your blood." Brenda clasped her hands together, tears ruining her expensive makeup. "You are our son. Please do not let them destroy us. We are family." I looked down at the three of them. I did not raise my voice. I did not move a single muscle. I simply stared at them with the cold, calculated detachment of a sniper, observing a neutralized target. "You told me I was a bad investment," I replied, my voice echoing with icy finality. "You were right. I deal in loyalty, and you have zero equity." Jamal stepped forward, bypassing the sobbing mess of my parents. He looked down at Brittany, who was clutching her $40,000 dress in a puddle of spilled champagne. The revulsion on his face was absolute. "We are not exchanging any vows tomorrow," Jamal stated, his voice a low, hard rumble. "We are going to have a very serious conversation about who you really are. This wedding is on hold indefinitely." Brittany wailed, but her theatrical cries fell on deaf ears. I did not stay to watch the rest of their manufactured empire collapse. I turned my back on my biological family forever, leaving them shivering in the cold reality of their own making. Admiral Winston gave a brief, sharp nod. The federal agents cleared a wide path. I stepped away from the plastic vendor table and marched down the center aisle. My 30 SEAL brothers fell into flawless formation behind me, forming an impenetrable wall of elite operators. Together we walked out the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom, stepping out into the bright, blinding sunlight. It was the ultimate, untouchable victory. The narrative of a decorated officer facing profound disrespect from his own relatives serves as a powerful reminder that true worth is never dictated by superficial metrics of success, wealth, or social status. In a society that frequently measures value through bank account balances, high-profile connections, and designer labels, it becomes dangerously easy to lose sight of the quiet, enduring power of integrity. The family's fatal mistake was confusing a cheap rental tuxedo and an empty bank account with a lack of actual substance. They traded authentic connection for the fragile illusion of power, completely failing to recognize the immense honor, discipline, and sacrifice standing right in front of them. This story highlights a fundamental truth about human relationships. Respect cannot be bought, and true loyalty cannot be manufactured. The elite military operators and the four-star admiral did not command the room because of their financial portfolios. They commanded it because they operated on a foundation of shared sacrifice, unwavering duty, and profound mutual respect. They represented a chosen family, forged in adversity, standing in stark contrast to a biological family that viewed their own son as a mere social liability. We often allow the opinions of those closest to us to dictate our self-worth, accepting toxic behaviors simply because we share the same DNA. However, enduring emotional abuse or hiding your true identity to keep a superficial peace only enables a cycle of disrespect. Realizing your own value means recognizing when the people around you lack the capacity to appreciate it. It requires the courage to walk away from tables where you are treated as an afterthought, and to instead surround yourself with individuals who recognize your inherent dignity. Take a moment today to evaluate the relationships in your life and commit to walking away from any table where your worth is not respected.